Reverend Jesse Jackson has been and always will be one of our nation's most consequential figures on the political scene. Has always been the fiery conscience for the nation.
I'm more convinced than ever that we can win. We have fought up the rough side of the mountain. We can win. I just want young America to do me one favor. Just one favor. Exercise the right to dream. You must face reality, that which is, but then dream of the reality that ought to be, that must be. Live beyond the pain of reality with the dream of a bright tomorrow. Use hope and imagination as weapons of survival and progress. Use love to motivate you and obligate you to serve the human family. Young America, dream.
Preeminent civil rights leader, a lieutenant of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Jackson is a voice that has challenged this nation's inequities, that has challenged the federal government, has challenged companies, corporations, has challenged individuals to rise to their best. But he has also forced the powers that be to confront the historic injustices that Black people have always faced in this nation. He has emerged as a towering figure in the last 5 decades, not only on the national scene, but also on the global stage. And that's why he is a global icon, perhaps the only political figure in modern American history who has successfully gone overseas to negotiate the release of hostages outside of elected office. No individual in our nation's most recent history who is not an elected person has been able to secure the release of American hostages in other nations other than the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson. And I think his impact and the work that he has done ought to be appreciated not only by some of us who have witnessed that over a period of time, but also by the next generation, the next succeeding generation, individuals who read in the books about the impact of Reverend Jackson. For me, perhaps one of my most memories would be in 2018, and this was in January of 2018, during a celebration of the Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It's called the Let Freedom Ring celebration that Reverend Jackson hosts in Detroit every year until he started to get ill. In 2018, I was a recipient of the Let Freedom Ring Journalism Award from Reverend Jesse Jackson himself. In fact, this was the award, and I keep it here as a lasting memory of Reverend Jackson's consequential impact, not only on the life of the nation, but on the lives of all of us as individuals who are part of the community of justice, individuals like us who will continue to challenge the forces that be, the powers that be, to do what, in the words of Reverend Jesse Jackson, move us towards a more perfect union. Reverend Jackson always believed in the power of the media. In fact, no civil rights leader, perhaps in our modern era, has been able to deal with the media the way Reverend Jackson has done. He's a master of media communication. But he also understood how to build allies in the media. And I think that has been the convergence point between me and Reverend Jackson. He saw me as an important ally in the struggle and in the movement for economic and racial justice. And I remember whenever he would come to town, to Detroit, one of his top lieutenants, John Graves, who's the chairman of the Rainbow Push Automotive Board, always will say, Reverend is in town, Reverend wants to talk to you. Even sometimes on his way to the airport out of Detroit, Reverend Jackson will be on the phone to talk to me about issues that are going on. And sometimes, I'll get a call from him from Chicago, talking. One time, his late chief of staff called me and said, Reverend Jackson wants to talk to you. And this was when he started, getting ill. And I was listening over the phone, and I could hear he was struggling to express himself. but obviously he wanted to say something. And this was during the entire struggle between the UAW and General Motors and Ford and the auto industry in terms of reaching, a labor agreement, an agreeable labor agreement. So Reverend Jackson understood the power of the media. He understood that journalists like myself not only ought to speak to the power, but we are important allies in the modern struggle for racial and economic justice. And I'll never forget this. On the eve of Aretha Franklin's funeral, I got a call from Reverend Jackson's top lieutenant in Detroit, Mr. John Grace, and he said, Reverend wants to talk to you, and then hands over the phone to Reverend Jackson, and Reverend Jackson said, I want you to join me for dinner. And I said, where do you want me to meet you? He said, no, come and ride with me. We're going to Beans and Cornbread. This was Beans and Cornbread, Northwestern Highway in Southfield. This was the eve of Aretha Franklin's funeral, the Queen of Soul. So I went downtown at the Renaissance Center where Reverend Jackson was staying, rode in the Escalade with him and his team, and we went to Beans and Cornbread. And there at Beans and Cornbread, we sat down, we were having a meal. And it was as if Reverend Jackson was the comedian of the night. It was as if Reverend Jackson was I'm trying to think about some of our great comedians. Chris Rock of the night. He started cracking jokes. He cracked jokes about me. He cracked jokes about John Graves. He cracked jokes about almost everybody on his team. And it was so funny, but this was Reverend Jackson up close. This is not the Reverend Jackson that we see in the media, challenging the power structure, challenging the forces in Washington, challenging the drivers of the international economic order. This was Reverend Jackson, up close and personal. And that was such a memorable time for me because I was reflecting, here we're sitting with a global icon, having dinner at Beans and Cornbread, we're ordering soul food, and so forth. And we're all cracking jokes. We're cracking jokes. And I recall one of the customers inside Beans and Cornbread, he had like a poster of iconic African Americans. And he wanted Reverend Jackson to sign one of his posters for him so he could give it to a family member. So he came to Reverend Jackson and was coming towards our table. Reverend Jackson got up and went to this customer's table and sat down with him, signed his poster and sat down with him for a few minutes and had a conversation with him. And then he came back to our table where we were having dinner. And then we continued our conversation for the night. And of course, we reflected on the legacy of Aretha Franklin, whom Reverend Jackson was very close with. In fact, Reverend Jackson was one of those who gave the eulogy at Aretha Franklin's funeral. So Reverend Jackson understood how to connect with media, journalists who he believes are important allies in the struggle for economic justice. And I think that's why the award that he gave me, that he personally presented to me at the annual Rainbow Push Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 2018 at what we now call Huntington Place, used to be Cobo Hall, where Dr. King gave the first draft of the I Have a Dream speech at Cobo Hall. The same place Reverend Jackson personally presented me with the Rainbow Push Let Freedom Ring Journalism Award remains very special. And I look at it and I reflect on this trailblazing legacy, this historic force of nature, this global icon, this individual who came out of an ordinary background to become an extraordinary human being, not only on the American scene, but on the global stage. And I say that we continue to be indebted to individuals, heroes like Reverend Jackson, for what he continues and what he has done for us. Reverend Jackson's legacy has really been consequential in many dimensions. I think one can point to his impact on the American auto industry, or on the global auto industry. I think he has single-handedly, in the last couple of decades, ensured that the auto industry not only plays fair by minority contractors and suppliers, but pushing the envelope of equity and economic justice. And that has been significant. I have been honored to have participated in some of those forums, sometimes even moderating a fireside chat with Reverend Jackson. And I think that has been significant in many ways to help the auto industry understand that we're still, in the words of, the immortal title of Nelson Mandela's book, we're still in this long walk to freedom. And I think that we cannot define Reverend Jackson's legacy outside of his impact of the automotive industry, and of course the role that his own top lieutenant, John Graves, has played in that regard as chairman of the Rainbow Push Automotive Board. And the fight to diversify the corporate boardroom, the push to ensure that black people have a seat at the highest levels of economic power, I think Reverend Jackson has had a role in that, and it goes back to actually Reverend Leon Sullivan, who authored this book, Build, Brother, Build. Reverend Sullivan came out of the Abyssinia Baptist Church out in New York, in Harlem, New York. From there, made his way during the throes of the civil rights movement, made his way to Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, where he was a senior pastor of the largest black church at the time. He led a series of economic boycotts. In fact, Reverend Sullivan, who was a civil rights activist, would be invited by Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta, of which Dr. King's organization, of which I have the honor currently of serving on the national board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Reverend Sullivan would train ministers on how to engage in economic boycott. The whole concept of Operation Breadbasket, I think that concept, to bring it to life, Reverend Sullivan was a crucial factor in that regard. And I think, I read a review a while back where Reverend Jackson even said that Reverend Sullivan was the closest thing to an idol for him, in that Reverend Sullivan's push, the Operation Breadbasket concept is what also Reverend Jackson took. And Reverend Sullivan was the first black person in the 70s to sit on the national board of directors of General Motors. He was the first black person ever to sit on a corporate board in this nation. And I think it was back in 70 or 71 when President Lyndon Johnson called Reverend Sullivan and said, "Leon, what is good for GM is good for America." So Reverend Sullivan got on GM's board, started fighting against apartheid. He forced General Motors to divest out of South Africa. And of course, Reverend Jackson has always picked up that mantle of the fight against the excesses and the injustices that we see play out in many dimensions of corporate America. Reverend Jackson has taken up that mantle and really has been consequential, impactful, and effective in how to ensure that minorities, suppliers, and contractors, and you name it, have a piece at the table of economic opportunity and economic equity. So I think it's important to put that in perspective. And I've seen that up close, whether it's interviewing Reverend Jackson, whether it is participating in some of those forums, and so forth. Over the years, I've been fortunate suddenly to enjoy, that kind of up-close observation of Reverend Jackson at work, which I think is important, when you assess historical figures, to be able to see up close who they are and what they do. And I think we have to honor our heroes while they're with us, but also talk about the consequential impact that they've had on the lives of the nation and, of course, across the globe as well. Reverend Jackson's activism has really inspired a generation of Americans, a generation of leaders. There are, countless federal judges, elected officials, academics who came through the ranks of the Rainbow Push Coalition, who worked on Reverend Jackson's 1984 and 1988 consequential presidential campaign. Well, Reverend Jackson, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, sir.
I want to begin by looking at your historic run for office. When you laid claim to the Democratic nomination, how did that pave the way for a Barack Obama presidency?
I don't want to be that presumptuous, but suffice it to say, at some point, someone starts saying run just to run. And if I had not run, it was like I would have set people up
Right.
to disappoint them.
Right.
So I ran in '84. I learned what is a surrogate. I learned to campaign in Iowa and New Hampshire, not just in the southern states. We were told you shouldn't go to Iowa. Iowa is too white. Only to get to find you can't be valid if you don't take it all on. So by going to Iowa, we found that the family farmer and who had lost their farm to the corporate farmer, and the black inner city worker who had lost their job to corporations going abroad, had more in common than they realized.
So it's an economic class issue.
Class issue. And so we began to hook up the family farmer and
Right.
the unemployed urban worker. And after a coalition was born, so we got double digits in Iowa. That was a big deal. We actually beat Gore and Gephardt in Iowa. That was a big deal. But how many whites could hear our voices beyond the limits of race?
That's significant. You mentioned that because, Jesse Run were the newspaper headlines. And people to this day refer to that era as one of the watershed moments in American politics, in democratic politics. Did you feel that you were on the threshold of a major change? And when you look back, do you feel it was a great move for you to have made that kind of a bold run and to really democratize the process?
I didn't know how big the moment was in the moment because I
Right.
was really running as an organizer. In the political season of primaries, the candidates determined the agenda in the press. We couldn't get our civil rights issues raised. We were talking about urban policy and free Mandela and gender equality. We couldn't be heard by running for the presidency.
Where he won a number of significant states, registered over 1 million voters, and really has been the standard bearer for political participation in the last 50 years because he has motivated a lot of people. He has given hope to what they could do. And when we talk about black political participation in the realm of American democracy and the rule of law, Reverend Jackson has been the standard bearer. A man who single-handedly, if you go back and look at the history books, in fact, even some of the videos of that era, when he was giving address to the Democratic National Convention, the man who ingrained the phrase, keep hope alive, has been a hopeful figure in the life of this nation. And people have come through the ranks of Rainbow Push Coalition, like I indicated, elected officials, public officials, and students across the spectrum of our national and international life. And I think one of the greatest honors of it was in 2016, when the University of Michigan hosted a national symposium to celebrate Reverend Jackson's 50th anniversary as a global civil rights leader. And I was very involved in that celebration. In fact, I initiated or helped to initiate that conversation with the University of Michigan in recognizing Reverend Jackson's consequential global and civil rights history. I remember discussions with the then president of the university at the time, Mark Schlussel, my email exchanges with him and so forth. But my point here is that Reverend Jackson has been a consequential figure around campuses in this nation. And that celebration at the University of Michigan in 2016, the highlight of it was a conversation between him and I at the Rackham Auditorium, the graduate hall, the Rackham Auditorium on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And he and I had a conversation for an hour after he gave a keynote address, talking about, America's place in democracy, the rule of law, and of course, addressing economic justice.
There's a tug of war for the soul of America. Shall it be aristocracy for the few and then make a lot of money and pay no taxes? Or shall it be a democracy for the many?
I know you just spoke with Senator Bernie Sanders. I'm curious as to your take. What do you think what was it that was underestimated about this election that has proven those perhaps who were thinking optimistically, supporting their other candidate, Hillary Clinton, wrong? What was it that was underestimated about this election?
In what sense, particularly?
Democrats were anxious that basically they were excited that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So obviously they underestimated something about the election that pivoted to Trump.
There are two issues. One, she did win.
The popular vote.
In a democratic society, the popular vote matters. And a suppressed vote matters, and there's a consequence. Between the popular vote lead and the suppressed vote, that dynamic equals victory. And we would not do well to assume that popular vote does not matter.
President Barack Obama, the nation's first African-American president, has less than 2 months in office. In your remarks, you said he should offer a preemptive, as you call it, pardon for Hillary Clinton. Are there other items or list of things that you would like Obama do before he exits the White House?
I think, first of all, in some perspective, when he came in office, we lost 800,000 jobs that month. You had a net gain of jobs every month since. That matters. The banks were in a global meltdown. They've been revived, not connected to reinvestment and lending, but revived. The automotive industry had gone down. Even Americans were laughing at low-quality cars coming out of Michigan. Now we're number one again. 20 million Americans have health insurance that did not have it before. Somebody said, well, the problem with affordable health care is it balloons at the end. If a new car comes off the lot and the brakes are not working, the steering wheel not working, you don't destroy it, you recall it and fix it.
And I think about that moment, that conversation that he and I had as an important chapter in the life of this man who has given the nation and the world so much. And that was significant. But also putting that aside, you know, the impact that he's had on college campuses and the fact that students, you know, who grew up in the 70s and the 80s will tell you they worked on Jesse Jackson's campaign. Some of those students ended up being federal judges, elected officials, prominent politicians, cabinet secretaries. Aside from all of that, I think there's also the bridge building aspect of Reverend Jackson. You know, he talks about creating a more perfect union. And part of that bridge building aspect of Reverend Jackson was, I remember several years ago, you know, I convened a Black Jewish forum at the Detroit Historical Society. It was a consequential, important forum, and where I brought Reverend Jesse Jackson and Rabbi Daniel B. Syme, one of the leading rabbis in North America, to talk about the history of Black-Jewish relations, something that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Was not only keen about, but also talked about. Reverend Dr. King gave a speech to the American Jewish Committee. He received the American Jewish Medallion Award in New York. So, and you know, several years later, I gave a keynote address to the 2012 American Jewish Committee annual Distinguished Leadership Dinner. The American Jewish Committee is known to be the first American Jewish organization that was in contact with Germany after the Holocaust. So in 2012, I was invited to be the keynote speaker for the Detroit region of the AJC annual leadership dinner at the Townsend Hotel in Birmingham, Michigan. But the Black-Jewish relationship was also key for Reverend Jackson. And so I convened this Black-Jewish symposium at the Detroit Historical Society. And I invited as speakers Reverend Jackson and Rabbi Daniel Syme, who was at the time the chief rabbi at Temple Bethel in Bloomfield Hills, which is the oldest Jewish congregation in Michigan. So I convened two of them together, a conversation that I moderated, you know, about the two leaders discussing the benefits and the importance of Black-Jewish Forum, which really shows also the bridge building aspect of Reverend Jackson's, what I called, you know, transcending legacy, if you will. And so when we look at the totality of the man himself and the work that he has been able to do, I think it is important for us to put in modern, contemporary, and historical context, this giant figure of a man rolled into one. And of course, on a personal note, I've, you know, happened to know and be close to some members of the Jackson family, like Reverend Jackson's oldest daughter, Santita Jackson. In fact, Santita Jackson served as the master of ceremony for the release of my book back in 2010, Obama and Black Loyalty, She flew here to Michigan and served as the MC at the launch of this book at Wayne State Law School Auditorium when I invited her to come. And this was, of course, I was one of the first black editors in the nation to interview Barack Obama. But I said it to say that, you know, Senator Jackson, who has been a good friend, I know his son, the current Congressman, Jonathan Jackson, an important voice in Washington, a voice of conscience in the halls of Congress in Washington, Jonathan Jackson, and so forth. But we have to be able to recognize and celebrate figures who have shaped not only American history, but who have shaped global history.